Most people are waiting for a permission slip nobody is ever going to hand them. Not literally. Nobody's sitting around picturing an actual signature. But watch how people talk about the life they want, and you'll hear it everywhere. Once things calm down, once I have more time, once I feel ready. As if readiness is a package sitting in a warehouse somewhere, waiting on a delivery date nobody controls. As if the person who finally starts is a different, better-equipped version of you who simply hasn't arrived yet. Here's the part nobody wants to sit with. That version isn't coming. Not because you're not capable of becoming them, but because the arrival was always going to happen the same way it happens for everyone. Not as a delivery. As a decision made by the exact same underqualified, underslept, mildly anxious person reading this right now. I used to think insight was the bottleneck. Read enough, understand enough, and eventually the understanding would just convert into action, into a different life. It doesn't work like that, and I wasted a few good years finding that out the expensive way. What actually changes things is smaller and less cinematic than people want it to be. It's noticing the specific moment you hand your own power to something outside yourself. A mood, a circumstance, a person, a someday. And choosing in that unglamorous instant not to. This isn't a book about manifesting a different life into existence through sheer belief. It's about something closer to the ground. How your attention, your attachments, your default expectations, and the small decisions you make on autopilot are already building the life you're living. Whether you're steering or not, you already have what the change requires. That's not a motivational line. It's just logistically true. The only question is whether you start noticing it today or keep waiting for a signal that was never going to come. Before we begin, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I read every single one. It's always interesting to see where this reaches. Chapter 1. The Waiting Room. There's a specific kind of person who has reorganized their entire kitchen twice this year, but still hasn't made the phone call they've been meaning to make since March. You know this person. You might be this person. I certainly was, for longer than I'd like to admit. Here's what that looks like up close. It's 11 p.m. on a Tuesday. And instead of doing the thing, sending the email, starting the workout, ending the relationship that's been over since June, you're doing something adjacent to the thing. Researching it. Reading about people who've already done it. Buying the equipment for it. Building an elaborate staging area for a life you haven't started living yet. Because staging feels like progress, and progress feels like permission. The waiting room is not a place. It's a posture. It's the belief, usually unspoken, that transformation requires some external condition to be met first. More time, more money, more certainty, more evidence that it'll work out before the actual living can begin. And it's a remarkably comfortable place to sit, because as long as you're waiting for the right moment, you're never actually on the hook for what happens when you start. The problem is, the moment isn't coming. Not because life is cruel or timing is unfair, but because the right moment was never a real category. It's a story we tell ourselves to explain why we're still sitting down. I spent about 4 years of my 20s waiting to feel ready before I'd call myself a writer out loud to another person without flinching. I told myself I was gathering more experience, more skill, more proof. What I was actually doing was avoiding the version of myself who might try and turn out to be ordinary. Waiting felt like strategy. It was actually just fear wearing a work uniform. This is the part people skip past too quickly. Waiting isn't neutral. It's not a pause button on your life while you gather resources. It's an active choice repeated daily to keep the steering wheel out of your own hands and hand it to some future circumstance that supposedly knows better than you do. And the strange thing about circumstances is they almost never arrive with a stamp of approval attached. They just arrive. Messy, mistimed, inconvenient. The same way they always do. Think about how change actually shows up for people. Historically, including yourself. Not in a moment of total clarity and perfect conditions. Usually, it's someone getting fired and being forced into the business idea they'd been waiting to have more savings for. Someone's spouse leaving and suddenly discovering reserves of independence they swore they didn't have. A diagnosis that reorders someone's priorities in a single afternoon, after years of them meaning to get around to it. The change doesn't wait for readiness. It just happens, and the person discovers, usually with some irritation, that they were more capable all along than the waiting implied. That's the quiet insult buried inside the waiting room. It assumes you're currently insufficient. Not enough yet. Missing some ingredient that a future date on the calendar will supply. But nothing about who you are today is actually incomplete. You have what's required to start the specific thing you're avoiding right now. Not a polished, foolproof version of it, but a real, first, clumsy attempt at it. The clumsy attempt is not a lesser form of the real thing. It is the real thing, at its actual starting point, which is the only place any of this ever begins. There's a reason this matters more than it sounds like it should. Every day spent in the waiting room isn't neutral time. It's a small, repeated vote for the story that later is safer than now. And votes add up. They become identity. The person who waits long enough eventually doesn't experience it as waiting anymore. It just becomes who they are. The cautious one. The one who's still thinking about it. The one who's almost ready. And there's a particular kind of grief that shows up years later, when almost ready quietly calcifies into a permanent description, and the person doesn't even notice the switch happened. Part of what keeps the waiting room so comfortable is that it borrows the aesthetics of progress. You can spend real hours, real effort, real money on activities that look exactly like preparation. Courses, planning, research, gear, and never once touch the actual thing they were supposedly preparing you for. The waiting room has excellent production values. That's what makes it so hard to leave. It doesn't feel like avoidance from the inside. It feels like diligence. You don't need a signal. You needed to stop looking for one. Try this test. Think of the thing you've been meaning to start. The actual thing. Not the sanitized version you'd say out loud at dinner. Now ask yourself honestly what condition you're waiting on. More money? More time? A clearer sign? Write it down if it helps. Then ask the harder question. What would happen, specifically, if you started today, with none of that in place? Not hypothetically ruined. Specifically. What's the real cost of starting messy right now, compared to the cost of another year in the waiting room, quietly becoming someone who waits? Most people can't actually answer that second question with anything real. The catastrophe they're waiting to avoid is vague, formless, a feeling more than a fact. And formless fears make excellent excuses precisely because they can never be disproven. You can wait forever for a threat that was never specific enough to pass or fail. The chapters ahead are going to ask you to look at several rooms like this one. Places where you've been sitting, waiting, telling yourself it's strategy. This is just the first, and it's usually the one hiding in plain sight, disguised as patience. Nobody's coming to hand you the version of your life you're waiting to deserve. You already have the only credentials required. They were never the problem. Chapter 2. The river that doesn't care. There's a particular way people fight with weather. Not the weather itself, you can't actually argue with rain, but the fact of it. The inconvenience of it showing up on the one day it wasn't supposed to. You can watch someone stand under an awning, phone in hand, genuinely irritated, as if the sky owed them an apology. It's a small, almost funny example, but it's a preview of something people do constantly with much bigger things: diagnoses, layoffs, a partner who changes their mind, traffic on the one morning that mattered. We treat the uncontrollable like it's a personal insult, and then spend enormous amounts of energy resisting things that were never going to bend, instead of directing that same energy toward the parts of the situation actually available to us. Picture someone standing knee-deep in a river, palms flat against the current, straining with everything they've got to hold the water in place. It doesn't work, obviously. The water doesn't even acknowledge the effort. It just keeps moving, parting slightly around the resistance, creating turbulence exactly where the person is trying hardest to create stillness. Meanwhile, 10 feet downstream, someone else has simply let go and is being carried, using small, efficient movements to steer rather than stop. Both people are in the same river. Only one of them is exhausted. This is not a metaphor about passivity. I want to be precise about that, because "let things flow" gets misheard constantly as "do nothing and hope." That's not it. The person being carried downstream is still making decisions: which way to angle their body, when to kick, how to avoid the rock ahead. They're just not wasting any of that energy trying to reverse the current itself. They've correctly sorted what's theirs to influence from what isn't, and they're spending their entire budget of effort on the first category. Most people never do that sort. They spend years, sometimes decades, expending real effort on things that were never going to move. Other people's opinions of them, outcomes that were already decided, past events that no longer exist except as memory, while the things actually within reach go untouched because there's no energy left for them. I did this with a business partnership that ended badly years back. For the better part of a year, I ran an exhausting internal campaign trying to get a version of events accepted that simply wasn't true. The version where I'd been entirely reasonable and the other person had been entirely at fault. I replayed conversations. I drafted emails I never sent. I built arguments for an audience that didn't exist and wasn't listening. None of it changed what had already happened. All it did was extend the injury I was supposedly trying to resolve by continuing to fight a fact that had already been decided the moment it occurred. What eventually helped wasn't accepting that I'd been right. It was accepting that being right, retroactively, in my own head, wasn't actually available to me as an outcome. The river had already moved. My hands were still pressed against water that wasn't there anymore. There's a useful, if slightly clinical, way to think about this. Your perception of a situation and the situation itself are not the same object, even though they feel identical from the inside. What you're actually reacting to, moment to moment, is your interpretation, colored by memory, mood, old wounds, expectation, layered on top of whatever actually happened. Two people can live through the same event and walk away with completely different residues, not because the event was different, but because what they brought to it was. This matters because it means the lever you actually have access to isn't the event. It's the interpretation. You can't uninvent a layoff. You can examine, with some honesty, what story you're telling yourself about what the layoff means. Proof you were never good enough. Or evidence that you'd outgrown a place that wasn't going to grow with you. Same facts. Radically different weight. Old patterns make this harder than it sounds, because most of us are hauling something. Picture trying to climb a mountain with a backpack stuffed full of things you grabbed on the way up without checking what they were. An old grudge, a belief about your own capability formed when you were 9, a fear that's outlived whatever originally created it. None of it is load-bearing anymore. It's just weight. And the frustrating part is that most people can't feel the extra weight directly. They just feel tired. earlier than they think they should, and assume the mountain is simply that hard. Letting go of one of those items rarely happens through force. You don't usually talk yourself out of an old grudge through logic alone. What tends to work is closer to noticing, actually looking at the thing you're carrying, long enough to recognize that it stopped being useful a while ago, and that you've just kept it out of habit. The way you keep a drawer of cables for devices you no longer own. Attachment works the same way, just aimed forward instead of backward. It's not only about the past, it's the death grip on how the future has to look. The relationship has to work out a specific way. The plan has to unfold on schedule. The identity you've built has to hold. Every one of those grips is a hand pressed against moving water, and every one of them costs energy that could otherwise go toward the actual swimming. None of this means stop caring, stop planning, stop wanting things to go a certain way. It means noticing the difference between preparing for a likely outcome and gripping a required one. Because the grip is where the suffering lives, not the preference itself. You can want the river to go a certain way and still keep your hands loose enough to adjust when it doesn't. Wanting isn't the problem. The white-knuckle insistence that wanting must be honored exactly as specified is. Try locating one thing right now that you've been gripping. A person's opinion, an old decision, an outcome you haven't gotten yet and have quietly decided you're owed. Notice what it would feel like, physically, to loosen that grip by even 10%. Not release it entirely. Just stop pressing quite so hard against water that was never going to hold still. The current doesn't need your permission. It was always going to move. The only real decision available to you is whether you spend your strength fighting that fact, or spend it steering. You're still here. 2 chapters in, that's not nothing. Most people who clicked this video moved on before they got uncomfortable. You didn't. Which means something in here is hitting close enough to stay. If that's the case, subscribe. Not because this channel needs it, because the next time you want this kind of thinking, you'll want to find it without looking for it. That's all. Back to the part that actually matters. Chapter 3. The body keeps score, quietly. There's a specific gesture people do without noticing, rubbing the back of their neck mid-conversation, right after saying something they didn't fully mean, or the way someone's shoulders climb toward their ears the second a certain name comes up in conversation, and drop back down the instant the subject changes. The body reports on things well before the mind agrees to acknowledge them. I used to think stress was primarily a mental event, with some physical side effects. Tight shoulders, a clenched jaw, the occasional stomach ache before something important. It took an actual doctor's appointment and a lecture I didn't ask for to understand it works the other direction just as often. The body isn't a passive recipient of your emotional state. It's an active participant, sometimes registering something is wrong before you've consciously clocked it yourself. Think about the last time you felt genuinely unsettled by a conversation, but couldn't immediately say why. Odds are your body knew first. A tightness in the chest, a shift in breathing, a low hum of unease, and your conscious mind spent the next several minutes playing catch-up, trying to construct a reason that matched what your nervous system had already concluded. This isn't mystical. It's just how the system is wired. Emotional processing happens fast, and largely below the threshold of language. The story you tell about why you feel a certain way often arrives late, as a kind of narration added after the fact. This matters because most people only intervene at the story level. They try to think their way out of a stress response using logic, arguing with themselves about why they shouldn't feel anxious about the presentation, the phone call, the appointment, while the body, which was never particularly interested in the argument, stays braced. You can win the internal debate completely and still walk around with your jaw clenched for 6 hours because the debate was happening in the wrong department. I learned this the slow way, through a stretch of maybe 8 months where I was, by any reasonable internal account, fine. Handling things, getting the work done, and also grinding my teeth badly enough at night that I needed a mouthguard. Developing a stomach that reacted to food it had tolerated for years, and waking up already tired in a way that had nothing to do with hours slept. None of that showed up on my mental checklist of things to worry about. My body had opened a case file my conscious mind hadn't even been informed of. The useful move isn't trying to think your way out of a body that's already sounding an alarm. It's closer to translation, treating physical tension as a message rather than an inconvenience to push through. Tight shoulders during a specific conversation aren't just tight shoulders. They're information about what that conversation actually costs you, regardless of what you're telling yourself about how fine it is. A stomach that reacts before a certain meeting isn't random. It's a fairly literal gut response to something you haven't consciously named yet. This is where most self-improvement content gets impatient and jumps straight to solutions. Breathe deeply, stretch, get a massage, without pausing on the diagnostic step first. Those tools are genuinely useful, but they work far better once you've actually identified what the tension is reporting on. Stretching a shoulder that's tight because of a bad mattress is different from stretching a shoulder that's been braced for 3 years against a relationship you haven't admitted is over. The stretch helps either way. It solves the actual problem in neither case unless you've also done the harder work of listening to what the tension is telling you. There's a reason exercise specifically shows up so often in advice about managing stress, and it's not just about cardiovascular health. Movement seems to give the body a legitimate outlet for a response that was designed, evolutionarily, to end in motion. The old fight-or-flight architecture expects an actual flight or an actual fight, not 8 hours of sitting rigidly at a desk absorbing tension with nowhere for it to go. When the discharge never happens, the tension doesn't just evaporate. It accumulates quietly in the shoulders, the jaw, the stomach, the sleep you're not quite getting, waiting for an outlet that a modern schedule rarely provides on its own. None of this is separate from the mental and emotional work the rest of this book is concerned with. It's the same system, viewed from a different angle. A mind that's carrying unprocessed weight will eventually hand some of that weight to the body to hold, the way you'd pass a heavy bag to whichever arm hasn't cramped yet. Which means physical relief and mental relief aren't really two separate projects. Loosen one and the other tends to follow, at least partway. Here's a small, concrete exercise worth trying today. At some point when you notice unexplained tension, jaw, shoulders, stomach, wherever yours tends to collect, pause and ask plainly what this might be about, without forcing an answer. Sometimes nothing surfaces immediately, and that's fine. Sometimes something does, and it's rarely the thing you'd have guessed from the mental checklist. Either way, you've started treating the body as a source of real information instead of background noise to be managed and ignored. The body isn't working against you. It's just reporting on the score more honestly and considerably earlier than the mind is usually willing to admit. Chapter 4. The garden nobody weeds. Someone cuts you off in traffic on a Tuesday morning, and by the time you park, you've mentally relitigated every inconsiderate driver you've ever encountered, extrapolated a theory about how nobody respects anyone's time anymore, and arrived at your desk in a mood that has nothing to do with the meeting you're about to walk into. One small thought, unchecked, grew into an entire weather system in the space of a 12-minute drive. Nobody plans for this to happen. That's precisely what makes it worth paying attention to. Most people imagine their thoughts as accurate reports on reality. This happened, therefore I think this, therefore I feel this. It's a tidy, linear story. It's also mostly wrong. What actually happens is closer to a chain reaction, where the first thought isn't the problem. It's the second, third, and fourth thoughts, generated automatically and stacked on top of the first, that do the real damage. The traffic incident lasted 4 seconds. The internal monologue about what it meant lasted 12 minutes and colored an entire morning. I think about this as a garden, mostly because the metaphor keeps being annoyingly accurate every time I try to replace it with something less predictable. A garden doesn't ask permission before growing whatever's been planted in it. Seeds don't check your intentions. Plant something corrosive, a belief that you're always the one who gets overlooked, a story that people generally can't be trusted, a quiet conviction that effort never quite pays off for you specifically. And it will grow, with or without your conscious attention, using the exact same fertile soil that would have grown something useful if you'd planted that instead. The unsettling part isn't that the weeds grow. Weeds always grow. That's just what unattended soil does. The unsettling part is how rarely anyone actually walks the garden to see what's in it. Most people experience their own thought patterns the way you'd experience weather, as something happening to them, external, uncontrollable, arriving from outside, rather than something they've been cultivating. One small, unexamined thought at a time, for years. I had a belief for most of my 20s that I wasn't naturally likable, that whatever affection I got from people was the result of effort, performance, earning it in advance, rather than anything close to a default state. I couldn't have told you where it came from if you'd asked directly. It just felt like weather, like an obvious fact about the climate of my life, rather than a seed, someone, probably me at some point, drawing the wrong conclusion from an ordinary childhood slight, had planted a long time ago. It took an embarrassingly long time to notice the belief wasn't a fact. It was just something that had been growing, unchecked, long enough to look load-bearing. Here's the part that tends to get missed in most conversations about negative thinking. Individual negative thoughts aren't actually the main issue. Everyone has intrusive, unflattering, occasionally absurd thoughts pass through on a regular basis. That's just the mind generating raw material, mostly at random. The issue is which of those thoughts get watered. A thought that arrives and immediately leaves does no damage. A thought that gets picked up, examined, agreed with, and repeated becomes something closer to infrastructure. It stops being a passing idea and starts being a lens you're now viewing everything else through. This is where the detective work comes in. And I mean that literally. Not as a cute reframe, but as an actual method. When a mood shows up that seems disproportionate to whatever triggered it, the useful question isn't, "Why am I like this?" which is too big and too self-condemning to actually answer. It's smaller and more specific. What exactly was I just thinking in the 60 seconds before this feeling arrived? Usually, if you trace it back carefully enough, there's an identifiable thought sitting right at the root. A comparison, an assumption about what someone meant, a prediction about how something's going to go badly. Naming it drains a surprising amount of its power immediately. The way turning on a light in a room does more work than any amount of reasoning about the shape you thought you saw in the dark. The usual suspects tend to repeat themselves once you start looking. Comparison. Measuring your current, fully visible situation against someone else's edited highlight reel. Catastrophizing. Treating the worst possible outcome as the most likely one. Without evidence. Simply because it's the loudest option available. Mind reading. Deciding with total confidence what someone else is thinking about you. Usually something unflattering, based on approximately no actual information. These aren't rare or exotic. They're common enough that once you know to look for them, you start catching them mid-sentence. sometimes even mid-thought, which is a strange and slightly disorienting experience the first few times it happens. What makes this harder than it should be is that thought patterns, left running long enough, stop feeling like patterns and start feeling like personality. I'm just a worrier. I've always been hard on myself. That's just how my brain works. These framings are seductive because they let you off the hook. If it's just who you are, there's nothing to examine, nothing to weed, nothing to be responsible for. But almost none of these traits arrived as some fixed, factory-installed setting. They arrived as repeated thoughts that calcified into habits. And habits, unlike personality, can actually be interrupted. Interruption doesn't require some dramatic act of willpower. It's closer to gardening than combat. You're not going to war with your own mind, wrestling every unwanted thought into submission through force. You're doing something quieter and more repetitive, noticing what's growing, deciding whether you actually want it there, and if not, declining to water it this time. That's it. Not eliminating the thought. Thoughts arrive uninvited regardless of what you'd prefer, but withholding the attention that would otherwise let it take root and spread. Try this the next time a disproportionate mood shows up out of nowhere. Instead of accepting the mood as simply the truth of how things are, ask what was just planted. Trace it back 1 or 2 steps. Usually you'll find something small and slightly absurd sitting at the root of it. An assumption, a comparison, a prediction dressed up as a fact. You don't have to argue with it extensively. You just have to see it clearly enough to recognize it's a seed, not a law of nature, and that you get to decide, today, whether it's worth the water. The garden's going to grow something either way. That part was never optional. What actually is optional every single day is which seeds you keep feeding. Chapter 5. The critic who never clocks out. There's a particular tone of voice people use only with themselves. You'd never say it out loud to a friend who dropped something, forgot something, or missed a deadline. You're an idiot. You always do this. Why can't you just get it together? But it runs on a private loop for plenty of people, dozens of times a day. So quietly and so constantly that most stop noticing it's even a voice at all. It just feels like thinking. I want to be specific about why this matters, because be kinder to yourself has become such a worn-out phrase that it's stopped registering as information. This isn't really about kindness as a virtue. It's about accuracy. The internal critic doesn't just feel bad. It's frequently, measurably wrong, running on outdated data, applying standards to you that it would never dream of applying to anyone else, and somehow still getting treated as the most trustworthy voice in the room. Here's the part that took me embarrassingly long to notice. The critic aimed at yourself and the critic aimed at other people are running the exact same software. Same tone, same instinct to find the flaw first and the context later, if ever. I used to think of myself as a fairly generous, low-judgment person toward others while being privately merciless toward myself, as if those were two unrelated settings. They're not. They're the same muscle, just pointed in different directions depending on the target. Which meant the years I spent being quietly savage toward myself were also, invisibly, training the exact same reflex I'd eventually aim outward at a partner's mistake, a colleague's misstep, a stranger's bad driving. There's a mechanical reason this loop is so hard to break once it's established, and it's worth understanding plainly rather than just accepting as a personality trait. The brain reinforces whatever pathway gets used most often. Repetition makes a route easier to travel, the same way a footpath gets more defined the more people walk it, regardless of whether it leads somewhere useful. Criticism, repeated enough times, doesn't stay a passing judgment. It becomes the default route the mind takes. The fastest path from mistake happened to verdict rendered, specifically because it's the path that's been worn in the deepest. This is discouraging news and useful news in roughly equal measure. Discouraging because it means the habit doesn't dissolve just because you'd like it to, or because you've read a persuasive paragraph about self-compassion. Useful because it means the same mechanism that built the groove can build a different one, given enough repetition pointed somewhere else. The path isn't fixed, it's just worn. I had a specific habit for years of narrating my own errors in the second person, silently, mid-mistake. You always do this. You never learn. As though there were a permanent record being kept somewhere, and every slip was fresh evidence for a case that had actually been closed a long time ago. It took a friend, mid-conversation, asking flatly, "Would you ever say that to me?" for the absurdity of it to actually land. I wouldn't have said it to a stranger. I wouldn't have said it to someone I'd just met at a party. I was reserving my harshest, least fair commentary exclusively for the one person I was going to be stuck with for the rest of my life. Judgment of others runs on a related but slightly different mechanism, and it's worth separating the two, because they often get lumped together as though they're the same failing. Where self-criticism tends to be corrosive and internal, judgment of others is often closer to a defense, a way of establishing distance from a flaw you're privately afraid you share. The person who's quickest to silently judge someone else's disorganization is frequently, not always, but frequently, someone quietly terrified of their own. The judgment isn't really about the other person. It's a spotlight aimed outward specifically so it doesn't have to land inward. None of this means criticism itself is the enemy. There's a real, useful version of self-assessment that has nothing to do with cruelty. Noticing you missed a deadline, understanding why, adjusting the plan. That's just feedback, and feedback is necessary. The corrosive version isn't feedback at all. It's verdict. It doesn't ask what happened and what to adjust. It asks, what does this say about you as a person? And it always seems to land on something unflattering, permanent, and slightly exaggerated. Feedback improves the next attempt. Verdict just accumulates, quietly, into something closer to a life sentence. Interrupting this doesn't require becoming a different, endlessly forgiving person overnight. That's not a realistic target, and aiming for it usually just adds a layer of self-criticism about not being self-compassionate enough, which is its own small, tidy trap. It requires something more modest, catching the tone before agreeing with the content. The next time the internal voice delivers a verdict, the useful move isn't arguing with the specific accusation. It's noticing the tone itself and asking whether you'd let anyone else speak to you that way, out loud, to your face, and keep the friendship. Try this the next time you catch the critic mid-sentence. Pause before finishing the thought and ask what you'd say instead to someone you actually liked in the exact same situation. Not someone you're performing patience for, someone you genuinely respect. Say that instead, even if it feels stilted or unearned the first several times. The groove doesn't care whether the words feel natural yet. It only cares whether they get walked. The critic doesn't clock out because nobody's ever told it the shift is over. That part, at least, is entirely up to you. Chapter 6. Rehearsing disasters that never happen. Somewhere around 2 a.m., 3 days before a routine work presentation, a perfectly reasonable adult is lying awake mentally rehearsing a version of tomorrow where they forget every word. The room goes silent with secondhand embarrassment, and their manager quietly reconsiders the entire hiring decision. None of this has happened. Most of it will never happen. And yet the body is producing a genuine stress response. Elevated heart rate, tight chest, the whole physiological package, in reaction to an event that exists exclusively inside a skull, aimed at a version of tomorrow that was never going to occur. This is worry's strange trick, and it's worth naming plainly. It borrows all the machinery your body built for actual danger and spends it on hypothetical danger instead. The nervous system doesn't distinguish particularly well between a real threat and a vividly imagined one. As far as your body's concerned, the presentation disaster you rehearsed at 2 a.m. was, in some limited but very real physiological sense, an event that occurred. You paid the biological cost for it. It just never showed up on the calendar. I used to treat this kind of rehearsal as a form of preparation, as if imagining every conceivable failure in advance was somehow armoring me against it, softening the blow if it actually happened. It took years, and a specific instance of nearly talking myself out of a job opportunity by exhaustively pre-living its failure, to notice the math didn't add up. I wasn't preparing. I was prepaying, in full, for a disaster on credit, whether or not it ever arrived to collect. Here's the part that tends to get missed. Worry feels productive because it's active. It has the texture of doing something, turning a problem over, examining angles, staying alert to risk, which makes it feel meaningfully different from doing nothing. But strip away the sensation and look at the actual output. Does an hour of anticipating a rejection change whether the rejection happens? Does replaying a worst-case version of a conversation you haven't had yet improve how it goes? Almost never. What worry actually produces, reliably, is a worse version of the present moment, spent bracing for a future that hasn't arrived and frequently won't arrive looking anything like the rehearsal. There's a useful distinction hiding underneath all of this, between worry and genuine preparation, and it's worth being precise about because they get confused constantly. Preparation is specific and actionable, reviewing your notes, practicing the opening line, checking the material you'll actually be presenting. It has an endpoint. At some point, you're prepared, and the activity naturally winds down. Worry has no endpoint. It just loops, generating fresh catastrophic variations on the same theme indefinitely, because its function was never actually to prepare you. Its function was to feel, falsely, like control over something that was never controllable in the first place. I've started using a fairly blunt test for this, mid-spiral. Is what I'm doing right now something I could stop doing and hand to a piece of paper instead? A checklist, a plan, a note? Or is it just the same fear circling the block for the fourth time with no new information arriving? If it's the former, it's usually worth 5 focused minutes. If it's the latter, no amount of additional circling is going to produce the missing plan, because there isn't one hiding in there. There's just more fear, dressed up as diligence. Worry about what others think operates on a nearly identical loop, just with a different cast of characters. Hours spent constructing and defending against a critical judgment somebody else hasn't actually made, sometimes hasn't even thought about you at all. Is worry borrowing the same machinery and aiming it at an audience that, in most cases, is far less invested in your performance than you're assuming? Most people, most of the time, are absorbed in their own version of this exact loop, worrying about how they're being perceived, which leaves considerably less bandwidth left over for perceiving you than the anxious math tends to assume. There's also a slower, quieter version of this same pattern that runs on autopilot rather than in sharp, identifiable spikes. A background hum of low-grade dread that colors ordinary days without ever announcing itself clearly enough to interrupt. This version is harder to catch precisely because it doesn't feel like an event. It feels like your baseline. But baseline dread is still worry. It's just worry that's been running so long it's stopped introducing itself. The redirection that actually works isn't telling yourself to stop worrying. which almost never succeeds and usually just adds a second layer of frustration on top of the first. It's asking a more specific question the moment you catch the spiral starting. What's one concrete thing available to me right now? And is this thought helping me do it? If yes, act on it. If no, and it's no most of the time, the honest move is naming it plainly as rehearsal rather than preparation, and redirecting the attention toward literally anything happening in the actual present moment, which is, by definition, the only place any real action has ever been available. Try this the next time a spiral starts building around something that hasn't happened yet. Ask what you're actually afraid of, specifically in one sentence. Then ask what, if anything, is currently within your control about it. Usually, the honest answer is some version of very little right now. And that answer, uncomfortable as it is, tends to drain the spiral faster than any amount of additional rehearsal ever could. The disaster you're bracing for tonight will very likely never show up tomorrow in the shape you built it. What will show up, guaranteed, is tonight. The only part of this that was ever actually real, and the part worry keeps quietly stealing from you in advance. Chapter 7. The Gap Between Wanting and Expecting. Ask someone what they want, and they'll answer fluently, almost rehearsed. A promotion, a healthier relationship, a business that finally takes off. Ask them in the same conversation what they actually expect to happen, and watch the fluency disappear. There's usually a pause, sometimes a wince, because underneath the polished answer to the first question is a quieter, less flattering answer to the second one, and the two rarely match. This gap is worth taking seriously, because it does more steering than most people give it credit for. Wanting is the loud, conscious layer, the vision board version of a life, articulate and specific. Expectation is the older, quieter layer underneath it, built from evidence you've collected over years about how things have actually tended to go for you, and it's frequently running the show while wanting gets to do all the talking. I noticed this most clearly with a friend who spent an entire year saying, with total conviction, that she wanted a promotion she was genuinely qualified for. Every conversation about it was optimistic, specific, well-reasoned, and yet, month after month, she found small reasons not to raise it with her manager. The timing wasn't right. There was a reorg coming, better to wait until after a big project wrapped. On the surface, patience. Underneath, something closer to a forecast she'd never said out loud. That asking wouldn't work, so there was no point exposing herself to the moment of finding out. She wanted the promotion. She expected to be passed over. The expectation was quietly running logistics while the wanting stayed safely theoretical. This isn't a rare or unusual case. It's closer to the default setting for most stated goals. People announce desires at the level of aspiration and operate at the level of forecast, and the forecast, being older and more deeply grooved, usually wins the actual behavior, even while the aspiration wins the conversation. Here's the mechanical reason the gap matters so much. Expectation shapes behavior more directly and more immediately than desire does. If you expect a conversation to go badly, you'll unconsciously hedge your language, avoid eye contact, prepare an exit, all before the conversation has even started, all invisible to you in the moment, all quietly increasing the odds that it does, in fact, go badly. Desire doesn't have that kind of real-time access to your posture and tone. Expectation does. It's been running longer, it's less examined, and it has its hands directly on the controls in a way a stated goal simply doesn't. Where does the expectation come from, if not from the same place as the want? Usually from evidence, real or perceived, collected over a long stretch of time and rarely re-audited. A string of rejections in your 20s can quietly calcify into a permanent forecast about how doors generally open for you one that keeps running its predictions well into your 40s, long after the original evidence has become irrelevant, outdated, or simply no longer representative of who you are now. Expectations, unlike desires, don't come with expiration dates attached. They just keep quietly forecasting off data that hasn't been checked in years. I had this precisely backwards for most of my 20s, assuming that because I wanted something clearly enough, wanting alone was doing the work. I wanted to be taken seriously as a writer. I said so to myself and occasionally to others, with real conviction. What I expected, underneath that, based on a handful of early rejections I'd never actually re-examined, was to be politely ignored. And for a longer stretch than I'd like to admit, I got exactly that. Not because the writing wasn't good enough, but because I was showing up to every opportunity already braced for dismissal, in ways I couldn't see clearly at the time, and can now recognize instantly in other people doing the same thing. Closing this gap doesn't require some forced, glossy optimism where you simply insist the outcome will be good and wait for reality to comply. That's a different trap, and a shallow one. Expectation isn't fixed through slogans any more than a groove in the mind gets erased by ignoring it. It requires the same detective work from a few chapters back, aimed specifically at forecasts instead of feelings. What do I actually expect to happen here, underneath what I'm saying I want? And where, specifically, did that forecast come from? Is it still current, or is it running on evidence that's a decade old and no longer describes the person doing the expecting? Sometimes the forecast turns out to be accurate and worth listening to. Not every low expectation is a distortion. Some are earned, current, and correct. But plenty of them aren't. Plenty of them are old data dressed up as prophecy, quietly vetoing a want before it ever gets a real attempt. Try this with something you've said you want recently. Name it plainly, then ask, just as plainly, what you actually expect to happen if you go after it. Don't polish the answer. If the two don't match, that gap, not the want itself, is usually the actual place to start working. You can't out-visualize an expectation that's still running the old numbers. You have to update the numbers first. Chapter 8. The Museum of Old Wounds. Somewhere in the middle of a shower that has nothing to do with anything, a conversation from 4 years ago replays itself with total clarity. The exact words, the tone, the thing you should have said and didn't. You weren't summoned there. Nobody asked you to revisit it. It just opened, the way it always does, uninvited, mid-shampoo, and you stood there rehearsing a rebuttal to a person who isn't in the room, hasn't been in years, and likely doesn't remember the exchange at all. This happens often enough that most people stop noticing it as strange. It isn't strange. It's just expensive, in a currency most people never bother to track. I think of it as a museum, mostly because the image keeps holding up under scrutiny in a way I wish it didn't. Somewhere in most people's minds is a wing dedicated entirely to old grievances, curated with startling precision. The argument with a sibling, preserved in full audio. The breakup, framed and lit from the correct angle to make the other person look worse than they probably were. The humiliation from a work meeting a decade ago, still on permanent display, still drawing visitors on slow afternoons when nothing else is claiming your attention. The unsettling part isn't that the museum exists. Some amount of memory, including painful memory, is just part of having a functioning mind. The unsettling part is how often people voluntarily walk back through it, on no particular occasion, for no particular purpose, and leave feeling exactly as bad as they did the first time, as if the visit itself accomplishes something, when almost always it accomplishes nothing except a fresh dose of an old injury. There's a specific kind of magical thinking buried in these visits, rarely stated out loud because it sounds absurd once you say it plainly. The belief that enough rehearsal will eventually produce a different outcome. That replaying the argument one more time, landing the rebuttal you didn't land in real time, will somehow retroactively edit the actual event. It won't. The conversation already happened. The version where you said the perfect thing exists nowhere except in your own head, and building it in more detail doesn't change what's already recorded in the past. It just extends the runtime of an event that technically ended years ago. I spent the better part of a year doing exactly this with a business partnership that had ended in a way I felt was deeply unfair. Nightly, more or less, I'd construct an increasingly polished version of the conversation, where I said the devastating, perfectly reasoned thing that would have made the other person understand exactly how wrong they'd been. It never happened in real life. It happened in my head repeatedly, at no cost to anyone except me, who kept paying full price for an argument that had no actual audience. What eventually broke the habit wasn't willpower exactly. It was doing the arithmetic honestly for once, instead of just enduring the visits passively. Every trip through that particular exhibit cost real time and real mood, delivered zero new information, and produced no outcome except feeling freshly wronged by something that could no longer be changed by any amount of internal argument. Once the cost became visible instead of just felt, it got easier to notice the visit starting and choose, deliberately, not to walk in. This isn't the same as suppressing the memory or pretending the event didn't matter. Suppression tends to backfire. Pushed-down material has an unpleasant habit of resurfacing sideways, usually at a worse moment than the one you avoided. The distinction that actually helps is between processing and revisiting. Processing has a direction. It moves towards some kind of resolution, understanding, or acceptance, and it eventually finishes. Revisiting has no direction. It just loops, delivering the same emotional payload on repeat, with no destination and no closing argument that ever actually lands. A reasonable question worth asking, the next time an old scene opens uninvited, is simply, is this visit heading anywhere new, or is it just the same exhibit again? If there's genuinely something left to process, a piece of the event you haven't fully sat with, an emotion you skipped past too quickly the first time, that's worth attention. Ideally with more structure than a shower can offer. But if it's the 40th identical replay of an argument that's already been fully cataloged, no new understanding is waiting at the end of visit 41. It's just the gift shop, selling the same souvenir you already own several copies of. There's also a quieter cost to keeping the museum this well-staffed. Every hour spent maintaining an old wing is an hour not spent building anything in the present, which is the only wing of the building still under active construction. The past doesn't need your help staying preserved. It's already permanent, in the sense that matters. It happened, it's recorded, and no further maintenance is required from you to keep it real. What does need active maintenance is right now, and right now gets shortchanged every time attention gets rerouted backward for no productive reason. Try this the next time an old scene opens without invitation. Instead of walking all the way through it, pause at the door and ask what specifically it wants you to notice this time that you haven't noticed the previous several hundred visits. If there's a genuine answer, follow it. If the honest answer is nothing, if it's simply the same exhibit on its usual rotation, you're allowed to close the door and walk back into the part of the building that's still being built. The past isn't going anywhere. It doesn't require nightly confirmation that it happened. What actually needs you is considerably closer than the wing you keep wandering back into. Chapter 9. The Things We Reach For Instead. It's 9:47 p.m., and someone's 3 episodes deep into a show they weren't even that interested in an hour ago, phone in the other hand, scrolling a second feed while the first one plays, and no part of this was planned. Nobody sat down and decided deliberately, to spend the evening this way. It just accumulated, one small reach at a time, each one barely noticeable, until an entire night had quietly gone somewhere nobody chose. This is worth looking at closely, because the reaching itself is rarely about the thing being reached for. The show isn't that interesting. The scrolling isn't producing anything. The extra glass of wine on a Tuesday isn't really about the wine. What's actually happening, underneath the specific behavior, is usually simpler and less flattering. Something uncomfortable showed up. Boredom, a low hum of anxiety, a feeling too vague to name cleanly. And the reach was an attempt to not feel it. Executed so automatically, it barely registered as a decision at all. I want to be careful here, because this chapter could easily curdle into a lecture, and that's not the useful version of this. The point isn't that watching television, or having a drink, or scrolling a phone is some moral failing requiring confession. Plenty of people do all three regularly and are fine. The point is narrower and more specific. It's worth knowing, honestly, what a particular reach is actually doing for you, because the same behavior can be genuine enjoyment in one instance and pure avoidance in another, and most people never bother to tell the two apart. Here's a rough but useful test. Genuine enjoyment tends to leave you roughly where you started, mood-wise or slightly better. You watch the show because you like the show, and you feel fine afterward, maybe a little tired, nothing more. Avoidance has a different signature. It tends to leave a faint residue of guilt or emptiness once it's over, a sense of having spent something and gotten less back than was spent, even if the individual moments inside it felt fine while they were happening. The hangover, so to speak, arrives regardless of the substance. It doesn't have to be alcohol. 4 hours of avoidant scrolling produces its own particular version of the same flat, slightly ashamed morning after feeling. I had a period, a few years back, where the reach of choice was work, which sounds, on the surface, like the opposite of a problem. Nobody stages an intervention for someone who's working too much, and I got a fair amount of quiet praise for exactly the habit that was actually a fairly efficient way of not going home to a relationship I didn't want to look at directly. The busyness wasn't really about ambition. It was about not having to sit still long enough to notice what I already half knew. Overworking can numb every bit as effectively as any other reach. It's just one of the few forms of numbing that gets rewarded instead of questioned. The specific menu of reaches varies by person, but the underlying mechanism doesn't. Food used past the point of hunger, to blunt a feeling rather than satisfy an appetite. Constant background noise, so there's never a quiet moment long enough for an unwanted thought to surface. Drama, sought out or manufactured, because a crisis over there is a reliable way to avoid attention landing on something closer to home. Even exercise, usually framed as unambiguously healthy, can quietly become another version of the same reach, when it's less about the body and more about not having to be alone with your own head for another evening. None of these behaviors are inherently the problem. The problem, when there is one, is what's being avoided underneath them, left unexamined and therefore unresolved indefinitely, while the reach absorbs just enough of the discomfort to keep the underlying issue from ever getting properly addressed. The numbing works, in a narrow sense. That's exactly why it's so persistent. It genuinely does blunt the feeling, for an hour, for an evening. It just never actually resolves whatever produced the feeling in the first place, which means the same discomfort is guaranteed to be waiting, fully intact, the next time the distraction runs out. The useful move, when you notice yourself mid-reach, isn't immediate self-denial. White-knuckling your way through willpower rarely holds for long, and it tends to just relocate the avoidance rather than resolve it. It's a quieter, more specific question. What am I actually trying not to feel right now? Sometimes the honest answer arrives fast. Loneliness, boredom, a specific dread about tomorrow. Sometimes it takes a minute of actually sitting with the discomfort of not reaching for anything, letting the feeling surface without immediately smothering it, before the real shape of it becomes clear enough to name. Naming it doesn't automatically resolve it, but it does something almost as useful. It converts a vague, formless discomfort into a specific, addressable one. I feel bad has nowhere obvious to go. I feel anxious about a conversation I've been avoiding, has an actual next step attached to it. The reach was standing in for the harder, more specific work of finding that second sentence. And once the sentence exists, the reach usually loses at least some of its grip, simply because it's no longer the only available option. Try this the next time you notice yourself reaching for something almost automatically. The phone, the snack, the fourth episode you weren't planning to watch. Pause for 10 seconds before doing it. Not to stop yourself necessarily, just to ask what's actually underneath the reach right now. Sometimes you'll do the thing anyway, consciously, and that's fine. Conscious choice is a different animal than automatic avoidance. Sometimes naming the feeling will be enough to make the reach unnecessary. Either way, you'll know for once what you were actually doing. The reach was never really about the thing in your hand. It was about the thing you didn't want to feel in the 10 seconds before you picked it up. Chapter 10. The root system nobody checks. Ask someone why they never speak up in meetings, and they'll usually give you a reasonable-sounding answer on the spot. Bad timing, nothing worth adding. The meeting was already running long. Push slightly further, gently, and sometimes something older surfaces instead. Something closer to growing up. I learned that voicing an opinion just got you contradicted. So eventually, I stopped bothering. That second answer wasn't manufactured for the conversation. It's been running quietly in the background for 20, 30 years, generating the first answer without either of you realizing it was there. This is the part of the mind most people never actually inspect. Not the thoughts themselves, which are at least visible if you look, but the beliefs underneath the thoughts, installed early, rarely examined, and treated ever since as simple facts about how the world works, rather than conclusions drawn by a much younger, much less informed version of you, working with incomplete data and doing the best it could at the time. Beliefs like this don't usually arrive with a label attached. Nobody sits a child down and formally installs, "I'm only valuable when I'm useful," or "expressing needs makes me a burden." They accumulate sideways from 100 small, ordinary moments. A parent who was warm only when things were going well. A household where conflict meant withdrawal rather than resolution. A sibling who got attention specifically for achievement, and none for simply existing. The child draws a conclusion from the available evidence, the way children do, and the conclusion, reasonable enough at the time, given what little they had to work with, quietly hardens into a belief that then keeps operating for decades, well past the point where it stopped being an accurate read of anything. I carried one of these for years, without knowing its actual shape, only its effects. The belief, once I finally traced it, was something close to needing help is a form of failure. I couldn't tell you the specific incident that planted it. There probably wasn't just one. More likely a slow accumulation of moments where asking for help was met with mild disappointment rather than support. But the effects were everywhere, visible to anyone but me. Projects taken on alone that should have been shared, help offered and quietly declined out of something that felt like independence and was actually fear, a low, persistent exhaustion from refusing to ever set a load down. I'd been treating the symptom, the exhaustion, the isolation, for years without once checking the root that was actually producing it. This is the trouble with root beliefs specifically, as opposed to the passing thoughts covered a few chapters back. A passing thought is loud and easy to catch mid-sentence. A root belief is quiet precisely because it doesn't announce itself as a belief at all. It just feels like an accurate description of reality, the same way water doesn't feel wet to the fish that's never left it. You don't experience, "I'm only valuable when I'm useful," as an opinion you hold. You experience it as simply how things are, which is exactly what makes it so resistant to examination. Nobody goes looking for evidence against a fact they've never questioned being a fact. Finding these roots usually requires working backward from a pattern rather than forward from a memory. Look for a behavior that repeats across unrelated situations. The same discomfort showing up at work, in friendships, in romantic relationships, in contexts that have nothing obviously in common except you. That repetition is usually a sign there's a belief underneath doing the organizing, rather than each instance being an unrelated coincidence. Then ask plainly, if I complete the sentence, "People like me are the kind of people who blank," what shows up honestly, before I've had time to edit it into something more flattering? The answer that surfaces first, unedited, is usually closer to the actual root than whatever polished version comes second. It's often a little embarrassing, which is a decent sign you found something real rather than something performed. Here's the genuinely useful part, and it's worth sitting with, because it tends to get skipped past too quickly in most conversations about this. A belief installed at 8 years old by a limited set of circumstances is not binding on the adult examining it now. It was a reasonable conclusion for a child with a small data set and no ability to leave the situation that generated it. It is not a reasonable conclusion for an adult with decades more evidence available, most of which the belief has been quietly filtering out because it doesn't match the existing story. You are, as a functioning adult, allowed to reopen a case that was closed by someone much younger than you, working with far less information, and redecide it based on everything you actually know now. This isn't quick work, and it rarely resolves in a single sitting. Root beliefs tend to have been reinforced for years by a kind of quiet confirmation bias. Once you believe needing help is failure, you notice every instance that seems to confirm it and barely register the instances that contradict it, which keeps the belief looking accurate long after it's stopped being useful or even true. Updating it requires deliberately going looking for the counter-evidence the belief has been filtering out. The times help was offered generously. The times asking for it actually strengthened a relationship rather than damaging it, and letting that evidence actually count, instead of being explained away as an exception. Try this with one persistent pattern in your own life, something that shows up across more than one unrelated area, always with a similar flavor of discomfort attached. Trace it back, as far as you honestly can, to the belief that seems to be organizing it. Then ask the only question that actually matters. Is this still true, based on everything I know now? Or is it just old, and still running because nobody's gone back to check? Most root beliefs were never audited in the first place. They were just installed once, a long time ago, by someone who didn't have the full picture. You do now. Chapter 11. The weight of things you own. Someone checks their phone 11 times in an hour, not because anything's happening on it, but because a small, low-grade alert keeps firing somewhere in the background. A status update to monitor, a number to watch. A thing that needs confirming is still where it's supposed to be. Nothing's actually wrong. The checking isn't in response to a real event. It's maintenance, performed on something that technically already belongs to them, and yet somehow still requires constant supervision to feel secure. This is a strange, specific kind of tax that ownership charges, and almost nobody budgets for it in advance. You acquire the thing, the house, the title, the relationship status, the followers, the reputation, expecting the acquisition itself to be the finish line. What actually happens is the finish line moves, quietly, into an ongoing subscription. Now there's something to protect, which means there's something to lose, which means there's a new, permanent low-level vigilance installed that wasn't part of the advertised deal. I noticed this most clearly with a car, of all things. A decision that, in hindsight, says more about the mechanism than about the car itself. I'd wanted it for years, saved for it deliberately, and the day I actually owned it should have been uncomplicated satisfaction. Instead, within about a month, I'd developed an entirely new category of anxiety that hadn't existed before. Where I parked it, who might be near it, a faint dread every time I heard tires screech somewhere in the vicinity. The car hadn't made me anxious by existing. Owning it had installed a new thing to lose, and the mind, obligingly, started standing guard over it immediately. This isn't an argument against having things, wanting things, or enjoying things. That argument tends to come from people who either don't practice what they're preaching or have never actually tried living without any material comfort at all, and it usually collapses under its own weight the first time it's tested. The distinction that actually matters isn't between owning and not owning. It's between enjoying something and needing it. Needing it specifically in the sense that its loss would feel like a loss of self, not just a loss of object. You can tell the difference fairly reliably by imagining the object gone. Not maliciously, just gone. Sold, broken, taken. If the imagined loss produces a clean, ordinary sadness, roughly proportional to what was actually lost, that's enjoyment operating normally. If the imagined loss produces something closer to panic, or a feeling that some part of your identity would go with it, that's attachment operating past the point of health. And it's usually attached to something the object was never actually capable of providing in the first place. Security, status, proof of having made it, evidence that you matter. This shows up far beyond physical possessions, and it's worth naming the less obvious versions, because those tend to run the deepest without ever being questioned. A reputation, carefully built over years, can become something a person guards as anxiously as any physical object, monitoring how they're perceived, managing every interaction with an eye toward protecting an image that started to feel less like a description of them and more like a possession that could be stolen. A relationship status can function the same way, less about the actual connection with the actual person and more about not losing the category. In a relationship, married, not alone. Regardless of whether the relationship inside that category is actually working, there's a useful, if uncomfortable, question buried in all of this. What happens to your sense of self, specifically, if the thing goes away? Not your comfort, not your convenience, your actual sense of who you are. If the answer involves any real collapse, if losing the job title, the relationship status, the possession would genuinely destabilize your identity rather than just your circumstances, that's usually a sign the thing has quietly been asked to do work it was never built to do. Objects, titles, and even relationships can provide real value. They were never designed to be load-bearing for an entire identity, and asking them to be tends to produce exactly the kind of anxious, vigilant relationship to them described at the start of this chapter. The freedom on the other side of this isn't indifference, and it's worth being clear about that distinction, because detachment gets misunderstood constantly as not caring. It's the opposite in a specific sense. You get to actually enjoy something more fully once your sense of self isn't quietly hostage to its continued presence. A car appreciated for being a good car, rather than guarded as a referendum on your worth, is actually more available for enjoyment, not less. The vigilance was never protecting the enjoyment. It was draining it, one low-grade check at a time. Try locating one thing right now, an object, a title, a status, that you notice yourself monitoring more than enjoying. Ask honestly what specifically you're afraid its loss would say about you if it disappeared tomorrow. Usually, the fear traces back to something the object was never actually providing, just standing in for. Naming that doesn't require giving the thing up. It just loosens the grip enough that you can finally enjoy what you already have, instead of quietly guarding it. Ownership was never supposed to come with a full-time security detail attached. Most people just never got the memo that they'd been running one anyway. Chapter 12. The peptide loop. There's a particular flavor of bad mood that shows up and feels instantly, uncannily familiar. Not just unpleasant, but recognizable. Like a room you've been in before. You can't always place the last time you felt exactly this way, but some older part of you clocks it immediately. Oh, this one again. That recognition isn't imagination. You have, in a very real sense, felt this exact configuration many times before, and your body has gotten unsettlingly efficient at reproducing it. The mechanism underneath this isn't mystical, even though it can feel that way from the inside. Every emotional state you experience comes with a chemical signature, a specific mix of neurotransmitters and hormones the brain and body produce together, tailored to that particular feeling. Anxiety has its blend. So does contentment, boredom, grief, the specific low-grade irritability of a bad Tuesday. And the more frequently a given state gets triggered, the more efficiently the body learns to produce that exact blend, the way a muscle gets stronger with repeated use. Feel a particular flavor of dread often enough, early enough, and your system essentially gets fluent in manufacturing it. Fast, accurate, and crucially, easier to trigger the next time around than the first. This is worth taking seriously because it explains something that otherwise looks like bad luck or a character flaw. Why certain emotional states seem to show up in your life with suspicious regularity, almost as if they're being sought out rather than simply encountered. It's not usually coincidence. A person who grew up around chaos and now finds themselves repeatedly in chaotic relationships they swear they didn't choose isn't cursed. Their system has become highly practiced at the specific chemical signature chaos produces, to the point where calm can actually feel wrong. Unfamiliar, understimulating, subtly like something's missing, while chaos, uncomfortable as it is, registers as recognizable. Familiar chemistry, even unpleasant familiar chemistry, tends to feel more like home than unfamiliar peace does. I noticed this pattern most clearly with a specific flavor of anxious urgency I kept generating around deadlines, long after any external pressure justified it. Plenty of colleagues faced the same deadlines with something closer to mild focus. I'd manufacture, reliably, a jittery, slightly panicked intensity days before it was warranted. Not because the situation demanded it, but because some well-worn part of my system had gotten extremely good at producing exactly that state under exactly those conditions. Going back to a childhood where urgency and adequacy had gotten tangled together early and never fully separated since. The genuinely useful piece of information buried in all this is that the loop, mechanical as it is, isn't fixed. The same plasticity that let repetition wire in the old pattern in the first place is available to wire in a different one. It just requires the same ingredient the old pattern had going for it originally. Repetition, sustained long enough for a new pathway to become as well-traveled as the old one. This is slower and less satisfying than it sounds when you first hear it, because it means there's no single insight, no one realization, that unwinds years of practiced chemistry in a single afternoon. What actually works is closer to consistently choosing a different response in small moments, over and over, until the new response starts arriving with less deliberate effort than it did the first 50 times. There's a specific trap worth naming here, because it catches people constantly once they understand the mechanism, using the knowledge as an excuse rather than a lever. This is just how my brain is wired, becomes a tidy explanation that quietly forecloses on the possibility of change. when the actual science says close to the opposite. The wiring got built through repetition, and repetition, deliberately redirected, can build something different. The mechanism that trapped you is the same mechanism available to free you. It doesn't care which direction you point it. It just responds to what gets practiced. Interrupting an established loop in the moment tends to require noticing it earlier than feels natural. Catching the first physical signal of a familiar state arriving, the tightening chest, the specific quality of restlessness, before it's fully installed itself for the day, rather than waiting until you're 3 hours deep into a mood that now feels like simple fact. Early interruption is considerably easier than late interruption, mostly because a loop that's only just started doesn't yet have the momentum a fully established one does. None of this is about forcing positivity onto a state that's arrived for genuine reasons. Sometimes the anxious signature is responding accurately to something that actually deserves attention, and the honest move is addressing the cause, not overriding the signal. The distinction worth making is between a state that's proportionate to what's actually happening right now and a state that's firing out of sheer practiced habit, disconnected from anything currently true. The second kind is where the loop lives, and it's the kind actually worth interrupting. Try this the next time a familiar, unwelcome state starts building. Instead of accepting it as simply today's mood, ask whether it's responding to something real, right now, or whether it's a well-worn groove firing on autopilot, the way it has hundreds of times before, under similar-looking conditions. If it's the former, let it inform you. If it's the latter, that recognition alone, this is the loop, not the situation, is often enough to loosen its grip slightly, which is usually all a single moment can reasonably ask for. The rest is repetition, same as it always was. You didn't choose the original wiring. You do get a say in what gets practiced from here. Chapter 13. The intention under the action. Two people compliment a co-worker's presentation in the exact same words, in the exact same meeting. And the compliments land completely differently, even though nobody in the room could point to a technical difference in phrasing. One version feels warm and lands as genuine encouragement. The other feels somehow slightly off, technically kind, but carrying a faint aftertaste nobody can quite name. The words were identical. What wasn't identical was what was actually underneath them. This is worth taking seriously, because most advice about behavior stops at the behavior itself. Be kind, be generous, compliment people, show up for others, as though the action alone is the whole unit of measurement. It isn't. The same action, driven by a different motive, produces a genuinely different result, even when the observable behavior on the surface is indistinguishable. People are considerably better at detecting this than they get credit for. Something in tone, timing, or micro-expression tends to leak the real motive through, even when the words themselves are carefully chosen to hide it. I noticed this most clearly in a stretch of my 20s, where I developed a habit of being reflexively, almost performatively generous. Picking up checks, offering favors quickly, saying yes to requests before I'd actually considered whether I wanted to. From the outside, this read as warmth, and I got a fair amount of credit for it. From the inside, it was closer to a transaction I hadn't been honest with myself about. I was purchasing approval, one small, generous act at a time, because some older, unexamined part of me had concluded that being liked required constant, visible proof of usefulness. The generosity wasn't fake exactly. I did want good things for the people I was being generous toward, but it was tangled up with something needier underneath, and eventually that tangle started showing. People began, subtly, treating the generosity as slightly obligating rather than freely given, because on some level they could sense it wasn't entirely free. This is the part worth sitting with directly. Intention doesn't just color how an action is received by other people. It changes something in the person performing the action in real time, regardless of whether anyone else ever notices. A compliment given to genuinely share appreciation produces a small, clean lift in the person giving it. Nothing complicated, no residue. A compliment given to manage how you're perceived or to extract a specific reaction from someone produces something closer to low-grade transactional tension, even when it's not consciously experienced as manipulation. You can feel the difference if you're honest with yourself in the moment, even when nobody watching from outside could tell the two apart. The same split shows up constantly in ordinary domestic behavior, well outside the realm of anything as loaded as a compliment. Cooking dinner can be an act of genuine care and even pleasure, trying a new recipe, enjoying the smell of something as it cooks, treating the hour as its own small reward rather than an obstacle between you and the next task. Or it can be executed as a chore to be cleared, resented the entire time, focused entirely on everything else waiting on the other side of it. The actual behavior, chopping vegetables, standing at a stove, is identical in both cases. The experience of doing it, and frequently the quality of what gets made, is not. Cleaning a house offers the same split. Approached with a kind of ownership and quiet pride, this is my space and I like keeping it in order, it tends to produce a small, genuine sense of accomplishment once it's done. Approached with irritation, focused entirely on how much time it's stealing from something else, the identical task produces resentment instead, despite ending in the exact same clean house. The floor doesn't know or care which version happened. The person doing the mopping experiences something meaningfully different, depending on which internal frame they brought to it. Social interactions carry perhaps the highest stakes for this particular split, because they involve another person capable of sensing the difference. Showing up to a gathering with a genuine, if modest, curiosity about the people you'll see there tends to produce real conversations and a satisfying evening. Showing up because attendance was socially obligatory, resentful the whole time about being there, produces a hollow evening regardless of how competently the small talk gets executed. The other people in the room may not be able to name exactly what felt off, but something in them registers it anyway, and the entire exchange ends up thinner than it needed to be. There's a specific and slightly uncomfortable diagnostic worth applying here, because it tends to surface things people would rather not look at directly. Notice a recurring pattern in your own behavior, a habit of favors, compliments, or acts of service you perform often, and ask, honestly, what you're actually hoping happens as a result. Not the story you'd tell someone else about your motives, the real one underneath, the one that shows up when you're genuinely alone with the question. Sometimes the honest answer is exactly what it appears to be on the surface. You just wanted to be kind. Often, if the behavior is compulsive or anxious rather than easy, there's something else quietly steering. A need for approval, a fear of being disliked, an old belief that your worth is conditional on being useful. None of this means every act needs to be interrogated before it's allowed to happen. That would make ordinary kindness impossible and exhausting, and it misses the point entirely. It means noticing the pattern, specifically in the moments where an action feels effortful, anxious, or slightly compulsive rather than easy and freely given, since those are usually the moments where a less flattering motive is doing more of the driving than the surface story admits. Easy generosity rarely needs auditing. Compulsive generosity almost always rewards a closer look. Changing the intention underneath the behavior doesn't necessarily require changing the behavior itself. You can keep cooking dinner, keep offering the compliment, keep showing up to the gathering. The outer form doesn't need to shift at all. What can shift is the internal frame brought to it. Choosing, deliberately, to bring genuine care instead of obligation, curiosity instead of resentment, generosity instead of a quiet bid for approval. The task stays identical. What it costs you and what it produces does not. Try this with one recurring behavior in your own life, something you do often enough that it's become close to automatic. Ask what you're actually hoping happens underneath it, honestly, without editing the answer into something more flattering. If the real answer matches the surface story, good. That's a clean action, worth continuing exactly as it is. If it doesn't, that gap is worth sitting with, not as a reason for guilt, but as useful information about where the actual work is. The action was never really the whole story. It was just the visible half of something that always had a second half running quietly underneath it. Chapter 14. The ordinary decision. The alarm goes off, and there's a decision buried in that first half second. Not a dramatic one. Nothing that would ever make it into a story about a turning point. Just the small, entirely forgettable choice of whether to get up or hit snooze one more time. Nobody remembers making this decision on any specific morning. That's precisely what makes it worth examining, because most of what actually builds a life isn't made of the decisions people remember. It's made of the ones that were too small to notice. There's a persistent myth, reinforced by every biography and every highlight reel, that identity gets built in dramatic moments. The leap taken, the risk accepted, the single bold choice that changes everything downstream. Some lives do have moments like that. But underneath even those moments, almost always, is a much longer, much less photogenic history of small, repeated choices that quietly built the person capable of making the dramatic one when it finally arrived. The leap gets the story. The 1,000 mornings before it, spent choosing to get up anyway, choosing to keep showing up to a skill or a relationship or a discipline nobody was watching, did the actual construction work. I want to be specific about the mechanism here, because small choices matter is exactly the kind of thing that sounds true and gets nodded at without ever actually changing anyone's behavior. Every time you hit snooze instead of getting up, you're not just losing 15 minutes. You're casting a small, mostly invisible vote for a particular version of yourself. The version who negotiates with discomfort and usually loses. Every time you get up anyway, groggy and unenthusiastic, you're casting a vote for the opposite version. Neither vote on its own determines anything. But votes accumulate into a voting record, and a voting record examined honestly over months is a far more accurate description of who you actually are than any story you'd tell about your intentions. This reframe matters because it changes what a small decision actually is. It stops being a minor, low-stakes logistical choice, coffee or tea, 10 more minutes or not, and becomes something closer to a rehearsal. Every time you choose the easier option under mild discomfort, you're practicing being someone who folds under mild discomfort, and that practice generalizes quietly to considerably higher stakes moments later, where the same reflex shows up dressed differently. Every time you choose the slightly harder option and follow through anyway, you're practicing the opposite, and that generalizes too. I noticed this most clearly with something almost embarrassingly small, a habit of leaving dishes in the sink overnight. Just this once, for months at a time. It wasn't about the dishes. It was never about the dishes. It was a nightly rehearsal in negotiating with myself and losing on a task with genuinely no stakes attached, which meant I was quietly practicing a version of myself who caves under minor resistance, in a context low risk enough that I never noticed the practice was happening. When a considerably higher stakes version of the same negotiation showed up later, sticking with a difficult project past the point where quitting would have been easy and defensible, the same well-rehearsed reflex to fold showed up too, right on schedule, because it had been in training for months on something as small as a sink full of dishes. There's a useful reframe available here, and it's less about discipline in the traditional gritted teeth sense, and more about noticing what each ordinary decision is actually rehearsing. The question worth asking in the small moment isn't, "Do I feel like doing this right now?" Feelings about minor tasks are notoriously unreliable and rarely worth consulting directly. It's closer to, what version of myself does this choice practice? Getting up practices someone who follows through on small commitments to themselves. Snoozing practices someone who doesn't. Neither choice, isolated, ruins or saves anything. The pattern over months is what actually writes the story. This isn't a call to optimize every waking minute or treat rest and ease as moral failures. That's a different trap, and a joyless one, that mistakes constant self-discipline for the entire point. Plenty of small choices genuinely don't matter and don't deserve this level of scrutiny. Hitting snooze on a day you're actually sick, or choosing the easier option because you've correctly assessed that today isn't a day worth spending willpower on, is just good judgment, not a moral lapse. The distinction worth making is between conscious ease, chosen deliberately because it's the right call, and automatic ease, defaulted into without any actual decision happening at all. The first is fine. The second is where the quiet erosion happens. There's also a compounding effect worth naming plainly, because it's easy to underestimate from inside any single day. A pattern of small follow-throughs doesn't just build a skill or a habit. It builds evidence available to you the next time a harder decision shows up, that you're someone who tends to follow through. That evidence matters enormously in moments of genuine difficulty, because self-trust isn't built through affirmation or intention. It's built through an accumulated track record the mind can actually check against, honestly, when it needs to know whether you're the kind of person who does the hard thing or the kind who talks about doing it. Try locating one small, recurring decision in your own life, something low-stakes enough that you've never really examined it, made on near-total autopilot most days. Notice honestly which way it tends to go, and ask what version of yourself that default choice has been quietly rehearsing. You don't have to overhaul it today. Just notice it once, with actual attention, instead of letting it keep happening in the blind spot where most identity actually gets built. Nobody remembers the 15th time they got up when the bed was warmer than the day looked. That's exactly the point. The moments that build you were never going to announce themselves as important. They were just going to keep happening quietly, until one day, the pattern had already decided who you were. Chapter 15. The people you become around. Someone walks into a break room already mid-complaint, and within about 90 seconds, 3 people who were having a perfectly fine morning are nodding along, adding their own grievances, and the whole room has shifted temperature without anyone deciding to shift it. Nobody voted on this. Nobody announced a change in mood. One person's energy simply moved through the room like weather, and everyone else's morning got quietly rezoned to match it. This happens constantly, in both directions, and most people underestimate how much of it they're both broadcasting and absorbing at any given moment. We tend to think of mood as a private, internal event, something that happens inside you, caused by your own thoughts and circumstances, that you then bring, more or less intact, into whatever room you enter. That's only half true. The other half is that rooms are porous. Energy moves between people constantly, mostly below conscious notice, and the person who walks in calm and grounded is doing something to everyone else in that space, just as surely as the person who walks in agitated is. I noticed this most clearly, oddly, through a coworker who almost never said anything remarkable, but whose presence in a meeting reliably lowered the temperature of whatever tension was already in the room. Nothing dramatic, no grand gestures of diplomacy, no obvious skill being deployed. She just seemed to bring a kind of settled steadiness with her, and meetings that would otherwise spiral into defensiveness or sniping consistently didn't, specifically on the days she was in them. It took me a long time to notice this as a pattern rather than a coincidence, mostly because what she was doing was so quiet, it barely registered as doing anything at all. The mechanism underneath this isn't mysterious, even though it can feel that way. Humans are, among other things, extremely good at picking up on subtle emotional cues from each other. Tone of voice, posture, the pace of speech, micro-expressions that register faster than conscious thought. This isn't a special gift some people have and others don't. It's baseline human wiring, present in everyone, operating mostly outside awareness, which means the energy you're carrying into a room isn't staying contained to you, no matter how internally you experience it. It's leaking constantly into everyone close enough to register it, and they're leaking theirs right back at you, whether either party notices or not. This cuts both ways, and it's worth being honest about the direction that's harder to admit. Most people are fairly quick to notice when someone else's bad mood has dragged down a room. Far fewer stop to consider how often they've been the one doing the dragging, walking into a shared space already carrying tension from somewhere else, distributing it slightly to everyone nearby without ever intending to, then wondering later why the room felt off. The honest audit here isn't just who affects you. It's what you're bringing in most days, without checking first. I had a period, a few years back, where I was carrying a fairly constant undercurrent of low-grade financial stress, and I genuinely believed I was containing it well, showing up to dinners, to friends' events, functioning normally on the surface. A friend eventually told me, gently, that I'd become slightly harder to be around, not because of anything specific I'd said, but because of something in the texture of how I showed up. A little tighter, a little more distracted, a little less available than usual. I hadn't said a word about the stress. It had leaked through anyway, into rooms I'd assumed I was entering neutrally. There's a useful distinction worth drawing here between absorbing someone else's energy and being responsible for managing it. Noticing that a room has gone tense because someone walked in carrying tension isn't the same as it being your job to fix their mood. That's a different trap, one that leads toward exhausting yourself trying to manage everyone else's internal weather instead of your own. What is worth taking responsibility for is the much narrower question of what you're contributing to the shared temperature, and whether you're doing it consciously or just leaking, unexamined, into whoever happens to be nearby. This isn't an argument for performing constant positivity regardless of how you actually feel. That particular strategy tends to read as false precisely because it is, and people pick up on the gap between a performed calm and a genuine one just as readily as they pick up on anything else. The distinction that matters is between processed and unprocessed states. A person who's had a genuinely hard day and says so plainly, "Rough day, I might be a little quieter than usual," tends to affect a room far less corrosively than someone carrying the exact same hard day silently, letting it leak sideways into every interaction without ever naming it. Naming a state seems to contain it somewhat. Unnamed states leak more freely, precisely because nobody, including the person carrying them, is tracking where they're going. There's also a specific practical form of self-interest buried in all this, worth stating plainly. The energy you bring into a room tends to come back to you, not through anything mystical, but through the simple mechanics of how people respond to what they're given. Walk into a room defensive and slightly combative, and you'll generally get defensiveness back, which then confirms whatever suspicion prompted the combativeness in the first place. A genuinely self-reinforcing loop. Walk in with something closer to warmth or steadiness, even on a day that's been difficult, and you tend to get something closer to warmth back, which makes the difficult day marginally easier to carry. This isn't a guarantee. People and rooms vary. but the pattern holds often enough to be worth deliberately managing rather than leaving entirely to chance. None of this requires becoming a different, endlessly cheerful person, or suppressing whatever you're actually feeling to protect everyone else's mood at your own expense. That's its own kind of unsustainable performance, and it usually collapses eventually into resentment. It requires something smaller and more honest. A brief check before entering a shared space of what you're actually carrying in, and a choice about whether to name it, set it down for a moment, or let it come with you consciously rather than leak in sideways without your knowledge. Try this before the next room you walk into, a meeting, a family dinner, a casual gathering. Pause for a few seconds and notice, honestly, what you're currently carrying. Not to suppress it, just to know it's there before it starts doing its work on everyone else without your permission. If it's something worth naming, name it plainly. If it's something you can consciously set down for the next hour, set it down. Either way, you'll be entering that room as someone managing their own weather, instead of someone letting the weather manage the room for them. Nobody's ever entirely neutral walking into a shared space. The only real choice is whether you're aware of what you're bringing, or finding out secondhand, later, from the temperature of the room you just left. Chapter 16. The thing people are too embarrassed to say out loud. Ask someone what actually changed things for them. Not the strategy, not the framework, not the productivity system, but the actual turning point. And if you push past the first few answers, a surprising number of people eventually land on some version of the same thing, usually delivered a little sheepishly, like they're worried it sounds too soft to count as a real answer. I started being kinder to myself, not as an affirmation, as a practical shift that changed what they were capable of. This gets left out of most serious conversations about self-improvement, and it's worth asking why, because the omission isn't accidental. Self-love has been thoroughly claimed by a certain aesthetic. Bath bombs, mirror affirmations, a kind of packaged softness that reads as indulgent rather than functional. Which means anyone with genuinely serious goals learns early to steer away from the phrase entirely, treating discipline and self-regard as opposites, as if you have to choose between being effective and being kind to yourself, when in practice the two turn out to be far more entangled than either camp wants to admit. Here's the part worth saying plainly, without the soft packaging. A persistent, low-grade hostility toward yourself is expensive in ways that show up directly in performance, not just in mood. Someone constantly running an internal narrative of not being enough spends real cognitive and emotional resources managing that narrative. Resources that aren't then available for the actual task in front of them. It's not a coincidence that people who report genuine self-regard also tend to take more risks, recover faster from setbacks, and ask for help sooner rather than later. None of that is about being gentle for its own sake. It's that self-hostility is functionally a drag on capacity. The same way carrying an unnecessary weight slows down a climb, regardless of how strong the climber is. I resisted this idea for a long time, mostly because it seemed suspiciously convenient, as though "be nicer to yourself" was just a permission slip for lowering standards, dressed up as psychology. What actually changed my mind wasn't a study, though there are plenty. It was noticing, directly, that my harshest periods of self-criticism didn't correlate with my most productive periods. If anything, the opposite. The stretches where I was most relentlessly hard on myself were the stretches where I took the fewest risks, asked for help the least, and recovered the slowest from ordinary setbacks. Because every setback wasn't just a setback. It was fresh evidence for a case I was already building against myself. Self-regard, done honestly, isn't about deciding you have no flaws or lowering the bar for what you're aiming at. It's closer to something more specific, extending yourself the same basic good faith you'd extend a stranger who made an honest mistake. Assuming reasonable intent behind your own actions instead of the worst possible interpretation. Treating a setback as information rather than verdict. None of this is soft. It's closer to accurate accounting, the same discipline applied to how you judge yourself that you'd apply to anyone else you were trying to assess fairly. What tends to unlock, once this shifts even slightly, is a kind of energy that was previously being spent entirely on defense. A person constantly bracing against their own internal criticism has less available for actually building anything. The same way you can't run at full speed while also flinching from a blow you're braced to receive from yourself at any moment. Loosen that bracing, and there's suddenly more available for the work, the relationship, the actual life. That was always the point. The second half of this, and the part people are often even more reluctant to name, is that self-regard tends to be the prerequisite for genuinely extending care to others, rather than a competing use of the same resource. Someone running on empty, running a hostile internal narrative about their own worth, tends to give from a place of depletion or obligation, generosity that costs something because there's no real surplus underneath it. Someone operating from an actual baseline of self-regard tends to give more freely because it isn't coming out of a deficit that needs managing at the same time. The old idea that self-care is selfish, that attention spent on yourself is attention stolen from others, gets the mechanics backward. The tank has to have something in it before it can pour. None of this requires grand gestures or a dramatic before and after. It shows up in small, almost invisible moments. The tone used internally after a mistake, whether a compliment gets accepted or deflected, whether a need gets voiced or quietly buried because voicing it felt like too much to ask. These are the actual, unglamorous mechanics of what people mean when they eventually, sheepishly admit that being kinder to themselves is what changed things. It was never really about feeling good. It was about no longer spending half the available energy fighting yourself before the actual work even started. Try this as a closing practice, simple enough to actually do. Notice, once today, the tone you use internally after something goes slightly wrong. Then ask, honestly, whether you'd use that same tone with someone you respected. If not, try the other tone instead, even if it feels unearned the first several times. It won't feel natural immediately. Almost nothing worth building does at first. This is the thing people eventually say out loud, usually a little embarrassed by how simple it sounds compared to everything else they tried first. It was never the framework. It was learning to stop being the opponent in a fight you were supposed to be the ally in. Here's what's actually true. Now that all 16 rooms have been walked through, nothing in this book was ever waiting for a better version of you to arrive and use it. Every chapter, the waiting, the gripping, the tension the body was reporting before you'd admitted it consciously. The weeds, the critic, the rehearsed disasters, the gap between wanting and expecting, the museum, the reaches, the roots, the ownership, the loop, the intention underneath the action, the ordinary decisions, the weather you carry into rooms, the tone you use with yourself. None of it required anything you didn't already have sitting somewhere inside you before you opened this book. That's the part that's easy to miss, because it doesn't feel dramatic enough to be true. There was no missing ingredient. There was only attention that hadn't been pointed in the right direction yet, and small habits of noticing, repeated often enough, to slowly change what gets built by default. Nothing here resolves in a single reading. That was never the design. The waiting room will still occasionally feel like the safest place to sit. The old grooves in the mind will still fire faster than the new ones for a good while yet, simply because they've had more practice. That's not failure. That's just how anything gets rebuilt, slower than you'd like, through repetition rather than revelation. one ordinary decision at a time, mostly invisible even to you while it's happening. What you noticed while reading this, the specific chapter that landed a little too accurately, the pattern you recognized before you wanted to, that's already the work starting. Not later. Not once conditions improve. Already. You were never actually waiting on anything outside yourself. You just hadn't been told, clearly enough, that the waiting was optional.